So I want to thank everyone. Thank you, gentlemen, today for joining. And before I turn it over to the panel, you know, there's a lot of news these days about climate risk. And if you read the banking publications, you'll see a lot of headlines or articles, everything from the FDIC to the SEC to the OCC. The OCC just announced a new director of climate risk, Dr. Nina Shen, who we actually spoke to a couple of weeks ago about this topic. And then the most compelling story that you should all be paying attention to is the New York Department of Financial Services in December just came out with a proposed guidance for New York State regulated banking and mortgage organization entities. And I think that kind of talks about the trend that's going to start taking place regarding climate risk and what the regulators will start asking about. I was having dinner last night with a banker. It was a $500 million bank. The FDIC actually asked the bank, what have they done? Have they done anything regarding climate risk? So we feel, this panel feels, including myself, that you're going to start seeing more questions like that from your regulators. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Joe. And Joe, if you can share with us some of your experience or comments about what's going on down in Washington and what the mood is down there.
Sure. Thanks. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Marc. Well, the mood in Washington, wow. I'm not sure we ever want to talk about that, but I'll be glad to talk a little bit, set the table here a little about what we see on the horizon, what's happening, what's not happening, and how that's going to impact this overall approach. Your comment about a $500 million bank, I think, is very instructive. What we've seen from the prudential regulators in the climate space thus far is officially aimed at banks of $100 billion in assets and greater. So, big banks, right? But that doesn't mean that they're not setting up expectations and looking at requirements for smaller institutions. And I think that's largely because in the prudential regulatory space, a message we always deliver, and it's true and it's accurate, banks have a long history of managing climate risk, especially as it relates to physical risk. If you've got a mortgage portfolio, you want to know, obviously how much of that is prone to flooding, things like that. That's something that banks have done for generations. So that also gives the regulators an opening to ask, I suspect, the very kinds of questions that the banker you talked with is talking about from the examiners. What are you doing in that space? Is it changing? Is that risk changing? And so that's on the bank, I think, to be responsive and to know that. And I think the good news there is banks are. They're aware of what the changing risks are. From the regulatory front, in addition to that guidance that they're aiming at the largest banks, they are undertaking what they're calling scenario analysis. And that is an effort to better understand how those risks are changing, both in the physical sense. We were just talking before the session here about, all you got to do is turn on the news and hear about mudslides in California, and it seems like weather's crazy. So part of that is to try and quantify that and look at what those risks are, but they're also looking at transition risk. And that's the risks associated with changes in demand, changes in market expectations, changes in customer expectations based upon maybe markets moving away from fossil fuels, what that looks like. And that triggers the next risk that I think everybody needs to pay attention to, and that's what I call the political risk. What is the risk of this, what actions you might be taking at your bank that you think are just prudent actions to take around climate or, pick any other topic? Well, depending upon, we've injected politics into everything these days. How is that perceived? Is that viewed as you're taking a political stance? Now, just to be clear, ABA's view is banks should be able to bank or not bank any business that is legal as long as you're not violating anti-discrimination or other laws. So we think you should exercise sound business judgment, what makes sense for you, for your community, for your customers, for your bank. And there may be reasons you don't want to engage in lending to a company, whether it's because of greater climate risk, or because you don't have the expertise, or there's reputational risk. But that view increasingly does not seem to be shared in the political spectrum. We've seen efforts, the SEC, and I want to move along here quickly, but the SEC proposal that's out there on climate disclosures, the SEC will say, well, that's within our mandate. They are defining materiality in a way, though, that clearly seems aimed at steering banks and others, it's not just banks, the SEC, it's all registered public companies, away from fossil fuels and other things. So there's a political element to that. There's also a political element to the pushback that we see in a lot of states where there are efforts to say, well, you can't steer people to ESG investments, or if you're not lending, we're going to penalize you if you're not lending to, again, pick your social issue. So those are all risks that have to be managed on top of the risks that banks have long managed in terms of especially physical risk. It's those transition risks that I think make life really, really complicated, and that I hope my fellow panelists can dive into and give some good guidance on. Does that set the table?
Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you, Joe. And I'll just kind of talk a little bit about our experience. And it's been very recent experiences with a couple of different banks, actually one in Maine and one over on the West Coast in Washington State. And, from being in the compliance world and the regulatory world for over 30 years, I've always said, don't put the cart in front of the horse. Let's walk before we run, and let's see exactly what the regulators are going to say here before we start moving in that direction. However, it's been a little concerning because the guidance that's coming out obviously reflects a position of, well, if you're under 100 billion in assets, then you really don't have to worry about it all that much. And yet, what we're seeing on the regulatory front is very different. You alluded to the bank we spoke to last night at 500 million in assets. And they were asked by the regulators, what are you doing about it? Well, okay, we can answer that question pretty simply. But what we found out on the West Coast with a particular client, this was a $15 billion institution, again, well under the $100 billion. But what had they done relative to climate risk? And their focus was more on the physical risk. We just talked about two different channels. You have the transition risk and physical risk, and we all do a very good job in assessing the physical risks and the assets within our organization. But we have to take it to another level from a safety and soundness perspective. Again, not from a regulatory or compliance, but from a safety and soundness standpoint, I think it is imperative that we don't become complacent or ignore it and think that it doesn't apply to us. We already have the tools in most cases. We have the data. In a lot of cases, and what we have to do is actually put the pen to paper and quantify what that risk is to the institution from a safety and soundness standpoint. Out in Washington State, whoops, I got to turn it this way, I guess. But out in Washington State, one of the things that occurred out there was mudslides, and what the regulators were concerned with was the percentage of commercial assets that were located in this particular track or location, geography in that particular market. And the bank had done a very good job, but where they got them on the regulatory front was they came in and they said, we're going to nail you for two things. On the regulatory side, on the compliance side, and that was under fair lending. They got very concerned about what they call redlining and reverse redlining. So there was evidence in one case where they were actually applying, well, they had redlining risk, or redlining red flags as a result of not lending in a particular market because the climate risk assessment that they had completed showed a high risk for losses. So they were able to quantify that and make adjustments, but what they didn't realize is what was the impact of that. The reverse lining, the red lining, was the same. It happened to be actually the same institution in a different part of that particular state. And what they did is they said, well, here's an opportunity where the risk is unbelievably high, so let's price accordingly. Let's go after them and increase our interest rates, increase our fees, grab a lot of fee income. Well, that's also illegal, so we've got to be very, very careful. So while I'm cautioning you, again, don't put the cart in front of the horse. I think we'd be remiss to think that if it doesn't apply to us, I think you're going to find out the hard way from the regulators that it actually does apply to us. And so at a bare minimum, what I have suggested to folks is, take a look at those physical assets, take a look at your deposits, take a look at your loans and break those down, residential, your consumer, your commercial, wherever you're really heavy in concentration, and geocode those and take a look at where they're located relative to some of the climate events that are occurring. I mean, turn on the news this morning, look at what happened in Alabama or down in the South last night with tornadoes. It was absolutely devastating. As far as the transitional side of it, this is where I think it's more applicable to those $100 billion institutions because they're focused on the industries and really the commercial presence and what industries could impact from a safety and soundness standpoint or have a real significant impact. If you have a coal company, I've actually seen it right drill down into the automobile industry. The policy that the green policy of moving away from gas vehicles over time. What's the impact of that? Somebody that's heavy in auto lending or indirect lending that can have a significant impact on your portfolio. So again, the institution in Maine, and I'll be brief, but it was a $3 billion institution, and they actually took more of a proactive stance and said, well, this doesn't seem too difficult. Why don't we go ahead and assess our portfolio and see where we have some risk? The question that they asked me, which was a damn good one, I felt, and that was, well, once we've identified what the risk is, what do we do about it? and that's where I had to kind of, step back and say, well, let's think about this. Let's look at the insurance policies that we have. What type of coverage, if we did have widespread damage, what's the impact on our overall portfolio? How do we sustain something like that? Should we be allocating money to our loan loss reserve as a result of it? So there's a lot of questions that really can't be answered, but I think, you certainly have to step back and think of, okay, we've identified the risk, now what are we going to do about it? And I'm not sure, in certain cases we have to provide a lot of what I call mitigation at this point in time because the regulators haven't come out and said exactly how you should address that risk. But I guess more importantly, I think the message is today, don't ignore it. It's not going away. I think it's, I'm really hoping that we have more guidance out there that's forthcoming from the regulators in this particular regard. But just, again, be very cautious about that $100 billion threshold.
Thank you. Len?
Yes. I think I kind of bring a unique perspective to this because I was a community banker for many years. I've been a regulatory compliance consultant for 28 years, and I was a state senator for a number of years, so I can see it from the political side as well. About 2 years ago, I was getting calls from community banks, not major banks, but community banks asking me what I knew about climate risk. And my first response to those first few phone calls was, don't worry about it, it's years away, there's been no laws passed, therefore there's not going to be any regulations yet. But I got enough phone calls, it provoked me to start looking into it a lot more, researching it. And what I found were two things. One is that the regulators aren't waiting for the lawmakers. They are going to pass regulatory guidance at the very least on climate risk. And the door that they're going to go through isn't something like another piece of legislation like CRA or the fair lending laws or anything like that. It's going to be safety and soundness. That's exactly where they're going to come from because they see this as a risk and therefore it appropriately comes under the safety and soundness issues and we're seeing our client banks are telling us that they're getting informal questions at this point in time from examiners about, well, are you even thinking about climate risk? And if so, what are you doing about it? Have you studied it? Have you got any way of measuring how vulnerable your bank is to it? So that's the first thing I've found, again, is that this is coming a lot faster and sooner than you think it is. It's on a fast track, there's no doubt about it. And this is not only at the federal level, it's at the state level as well. The second thing I found out, to my surprise and to my satisfaction, was there actually is an abundant amount of data out there that's available to analyze climate risk, multiple numbers of climate-related hazards, hurricanes, tsunamis, severe drought, extreme cold weather, et cetera.
Wind, I think.
Wind, yeah, right, wind, high winds, et cetera. So there is an abundance of data that's there if you know where to find it and where to look for it. We stumbled on it after doing months of research, and we've got this huge database now that we can use. We've been talking to the regulators about as well, that contains a plethora of climate-related phenomena, and it's based on a long-term history. It's been studies done by FEMA and federal agencies, as well as by a multiple number of universities, and they've studied the history of these natural occurring events, again, hurricanes, tsunamis, et cetera, and they incorporated it into a massive file that can be used for climate risk assessments. So the second thing I want to mention is that I look at climate risk as falling into three different categories. One is the immediate category, the immediate risk that presents itself today to banks. Ask the banks out in California about what's going on now, or the banks in Florida about the hurricanes that hit down there and the impact it had on them and on their customers. So there's the immediate risk that presents itself today. Then there's the long-term risk, the risk that is foreseen 25, 50, even through the year 2100. And that to me is a far more controversial topic. And then there's the transition risk, going from where we are today to where we might be in the year 2100. To me, I think the initial phase of climate-related risk regulations should be, and probably will be, focused on the immediate risk. They're the risks that actually do exist today. There's no speculation involved in it, and therefore it's more real, it's less controversial. And having been a state senator for a number of terms, I learned that when you get into controversial topics, the best approach is to start slow, take the least controversial aspects of that issue and bring it into law, and then you build on it over time. So I think that's what you're going to see. And I do know that you're going to start getting much more serious questions about and expectations about your bank doing something to measure, identify climate risk as it exists today for your bank. The third point I'll make is this. Bankers are faced with a choice: lead or be led, because the regulators are going to go full speed ahead no matter what. And I believe this is one of those moments in time when the banking community itself can lead in this area rather than resist it or fight it or ignore it. And then if you play the leading role in this, then you're more likely to get realistic and pragmatic regulations versus God knows what comes out of some of the heads of the people down in Washington. And I know this from a conversation I had with Dr. Nina Chen, she's the Chief Climate Risk Officer for the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. The regulators are at that stage right now where they're researching what banks are doing. So this is the time when you can have an influence on how the regulations and how the guidance are going to be promulgated. The New York State Department of Financial Services has got proposed guidance out right now, and again, none of you are probably from New York, so you're not concerned about that, but they are looking for feedback from the community about their proposed climate risk guidance. And again, the OCC did it last year. So this is an opportunity. You have a choice. Look at it as a threat or look at it as an opportunity. And I look at it as an opportunity. This is your chance to influence the way the regulations will go and make it a more realistic guidance and regulations that will be pertinent to your operation rather than just wait for them to make it happen. Then you're at their mercy.
Thank you. That's terrific. When I talk about this topic with some of my banking clients, sometimes the initial reaction is, well, there are no regulations or statutes that have been created yet, so why should I worry about it? And what can a regulator do about climate risk? Does anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, Mark, I'll start off on that one. I think we've just heard the exact reason you need to worry about it. You don't need a specific climate regulation or law. Safety and soundness, fair lending, CRA, all are applicable in this space. They want to know how you're managing what they perceive as your climate risk to your physical portfolio, to those transition risks we talked about. And the great tension, I think Dean touched on this, but I think it's something that is going to be a real challenge going forward, is the interplay between those safety and soundness efforts and your obligations under fair lending and CRA. Blue lining is a term that I've heard used for withdrawing from lending in coastal areas. And all you got to do, it's relevant in New England, but look at New Orleans. You can't just pull out of the entire lower Ninth Ward and not imagine that you're going to get dinged on CRA and fair lending.
Yeah, and I also think that you take a look at one regulatory area in itself. We mentioned obviously fair lending and CRA. There's another emerging issue out there, and it's called UDAB, in case we haven't heard of it lately. And we're seeing this being applied. It's really the broad brush regulation, originally managed by the FTC, now the authority with the CFPB. The recent conflation of two regulatory schemes with the unfairness standard and then applying it under ECOA in discrimination. That's not the intent of Congress. It wasn't the intent of them to begin with. So you can see, again, the regulators can really do what they want to do. They don't need regulations out there to say this is what we're going to do, or this is how we're going to apply it, or this is how we're going to interpret it. So I think, here's a situation where I say, walk before you run. I do think we have to be a little bit more proactive, even though there aren't regulations out there. And again, from a safety and soundness standpoint, I think it makes sense. Obviously, we have regulatory concerns as a result of us assessing climate risk if we start taking action relative to those risks. And what action are we taking? Are we adjusting marketing plans so that we're targeting particular areas that are more vulnerable? Are we stopping the lending altogether in those particular areas? What's the impact of that? Can we do that from a legal perspective or a fairness standard? So we, again, I think it's important for us to get out in front of it, assess what the risk is, so that we can at least share with the regulators, look, we know where our assets are, we know what the risk to our assets are. And again, talking about physical risk, I think it's important that institutions do that. And then the regulators themselves will offer some guidance as to how we should best mitigate those particular risks. The fact that you've identified them and took that proactive stance, I think, is really going to be important.
Yeah, it's essential, of course. What's the starting point? You've got to know where you start. Most people are just clueless about, well, okay, where do I find this climate risk data? So having access to climate risk data is the beginning for everybody, and even the regulators themselves don't seem to be aware of some of the data that we found with our research on the internet, which is fabulous stuff. We can map out and have mapped out every single census tract in the entire country, and we know the different climate risk hazards that are associated with each census tract. So once you do that, you can take a loan portfolio, geocode it to a census tract level, not unlike what you do for HMDA and CRA purposes, and then you can identify not the tract income class or the minority status of the tract, but the climate risk associated with the tract along a whole string of these naturally occurring hazards. And Joe, you mentioned, I think, about CRA. Embedded in the CRA proposal, which is being considered right now, is a proposal regarding climate risk and banks' financing of projects to mitigate climate risk, particularly in the lower income tracts and the minority community itself. So I can't say this enough. It's a mistake to wait for the regulators to act. They already are acting, whether you know it or not. And they're not waiting for lawmakers to change the laws. They're using the existing regulatory framework for doing this.
And you're talking about the safety and soundness.
Safety and soundness, right. And now CRA, of course, they're definitely going to bring it in under CRA. So, and I wouldn't be surprised in your next exams you're going to be asked, what are you doing? Now, you're not going to be initially penalized for doing nothing, but they're probing. They're trying to find out who's doing what. And the banks that take the lead are going to have the opportunity to set the table and set the standards rather than, somebody once said there's three kinds of people in the world. There's people who make things happen, there's people who watch what happened, and there's people who wonder what happened. Well, you want to be in the first kind of group. You want to be the people who make things happen. And you can have, this is one of those opportunities because the regulations haven't been specifically formulated yet. This is a tremendous opportunity for you and your institution to have an impact on this. It's going to come, like it or not, so you might as well face that, and you might as well exercise the opportunity to have an influence and make certain it's a realistic, pragmatic regulation and practice.
So I just, for our sake, a show of hands, have any banks been asked by their regulators yet, what have they done, or have they done anything regarding climate risk?
Yeah, you got a few.
So we have a couple of banks that have been asked that question. Okay? Now, we've talked about how the regulators most likely will not wait for Congress to pass climate risk laws, okay? But what you're saying is you feel this could fall under the safety and soundness rulings.
Let me make
correct?
a quick comment about that,
So
Mark.
you can, just because I think that is a very compelling statement that you're making, because I know that a lot of bankers are saying, oh, I'm going to wait until a regulation comes out.
Right.
And I want to make sure the audience hears that loud and clear, that you really shouldn't wait. You should be proactive now. Can you expound on that?
Well, again, what's going on here is the regulators are initiating this. We know it. Anybody who's reading the headlines, it's prominent on the regulatory agenda, I would say. We had a great lively discussion last night in your suite, basically, with a number of bankers about this. Like, well, how do you figure out what the risk is, and what do you do about it when you do measure it?
Right.
And that's what Dean was alluding to, too. And this is groundbreaking stuff, so a lot of things need to be developed yet. But it was a great conversation because it got me thinking, okay, we can help banks identify specific risks and rate those risks and quantify those risks, but then what happens after that? And it got me thinking about, okay, well, what can you do as a bank once you identify that you've got a certain type of climate hazard? Let's just say you're in an area that's at a high risk for hurricanes or something like that. Well, what do we do about it? And there's different options that are available. I mean, one, of course, is insurance. Another is a risk premium in the pricing of loans. Another is, okay, our risk appetite, this is a phrase that you see constantly mentioned, what's the risk appetite of the institution? So if our risk appetite for this kind of risk in this area is going to be limited to $100 million or $50 million or whatever it is. So there's a lot of opportunity to talk about what the mitigating actions would be, what you can do to reduce your exposure to climate risk. And you can actually measure it right now with the data that's available.
Couple of observations on that. I think you're exactly right. You mentioned insurance. Insurance is a first line of defense on this, but increasingly, I think at FDIC Chair Grunberg spoke at our annual convention last year, and he spoke a long time, but throughout it, he repeatedly mentioned availability and affordability of insurance as an issue. That tells me the regulators are looking at that. We've seen this play out before in other scenarios, but what happens if that first line of defense fails? And when you get into climate, just take the National Flood Insurance Program as an example. That is a program that is truly a house of cards. It hasn't been reauthorized fully in, 12 years. And it's just limping along. It's at least $18 billion in debt to the Treasury. That's a pretty shaky foundation. And so, I think looking at those issues and focusing on mitigation, you mentioned the CRA proposal. I think this is an area where banks can really lead in terms of looking at risks and looking at ways to mitigate those, and being proactive and not just responsive and playing defense.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned flood. There's no regulations for flood, in case we didn't know that. There are laws that we have to comply with in mandatory purchase guidelines that they've issued. But there is a perfect example right there. Flood does not have regulatory requirements around it. And so this is a really good example. Again, that would be a climate-related event as well. And you can see that they can set expectations relative to it. And if we sit around and wait for things to happen in Washington, well, we're going to be sitting around for quite a while. Because as you can see, bills aren't moving. I use the marijuana-related bills that have been in Washington for how many years now? And we found a way to address the risk. A lot of us have internally, and we haven't waited for regulations to come out as it relates to marijuana-related businesses. And I think this is very similar to that as well.
Could this go beyond, I mean, we've talked, I think, a lot about your bank's loan portfolio, but could you also measure or apply this to bank deposits or their facilities or branches? Does anyone want to talk about that a little bit more, and especially this database you're referring to?
The database that we have is on a census tract level. So if you can geocode a record to a tract, just like you do for HMDA and CRA, you could do the same thing for your facilities. You want to know which of your branches are in certain areas that are exposed to. But believe it or not, we did a map from maps for a bank up in Massachusetts, and I was shocked by some of the results we found. This bank, is a mid-sized bank. I mean, it's $1 billion plus or something like that, and they had a series of branches that were in, believe it or not, relatively moderately high risk for earthquake. Which
In Massachusetts.
Yeah, I was surprised. This is predicated on the data that has been developed through FEMA and these different federal agencies and a dozen universities or so. And when we mapped it out, we used color-coded maps. You can see the tracks light up that have the high risk, in this case, for earthquake. There was also some exposure for drought and things like that. So the excuse that there's no data there can't apply anymore. It's actually there. Now, I do think there's a huge distinction between the real risk that exists today and the speculative risk about what may happen over the next 20, 30, or 40 years. And I don't think, I know this, I'm certain that regulators, in either the form of regulations or guidance, they're not going to have the same level of expectation for community banks as they will for the major banks, the $100 billion. I don't think they're going to expect the community banks to do scenario analysis, for example, which is really complicated and highly speculative. But they will expect the banks to be able to say, well, what am I exposed to today? What risk do I have? And what is your board aware of it? And what are you doing about it?
And what you refer to as the immediate risk.
That's right, the immediate risk. And so it can be done for any asset or anything on the balance sheet.
So, I mean, I'm sure everyone has heard the term climate change. Mm-hmm. Are we talking about climate change? Are we talking about, climate risk? This is where people start.
What I'm talking about is climate risk, not climate change, because climate change is that transition period you're talking about that's much more.
Is that long-term risk that you're talking about 50 years, 100 years out?
Yeah. So to me, this is the least controversial part of it. Again, speaking as a former state senator, if I were advocating legislation along these lines, that's what I would be doing. I would just say, okay, let's avoid the controversy. Let's stick with what's real and immediate and measurable, and that's going to be more compatible with banks too, by the way, because you're not thinking, well, where is our bank going to be in the year 2100? You're thinking, well, where are we going to be next year or 2 years from now or 3 years from now? So I think it meets the same time horizons as most banks are concerned about in their strategic planning.
I just want to say 100% agree with what Len said there. Just to go to your question, I think climate change is a very politicized term, and there are people all over the map on that. Absolutely. Climate risk, and what we keep focusing on with the regulators is please keep focusing on climate's risk to banks, not banks' risk to the climate. That's
very well put.
And if I could say, the carbon issue is not involved in this immediate climate risk. That's really controversial. They don't want you to stop lending to fossil fuel companies. That's a totally different ballgame altogether, and I don't think that's going to be
gas
involved in
stoves?
this. What's that?
Yeah. Or gas stoves. That's the transition risk that we're referring to. So, I don't want to say avoid the transition risk, but I think it's certainly less of an issue with community banks as it would be applicable to those larger $100 billion banks that do a lot of industry level lending. So I think physical risk, again, the present risk, as the panel has just alluded to, is probably the safest and most sound thing you could do at this point.
I think we're doing pretty good on time. I'm going to open it up to the audience. If anyone has any questions, feel free to stand up and shout your question out. Okay.
Maybe we could ask the audience some questions, like, I'd be curious, how many people have even talked about climate risk in their senior management meetings or board meetings?
Good question.
Could we have a show of hands about that? Okay, but there's a number of hands up, but there's a lot of hands that are not up. It's a big mistake to be silent about this now. You've got to bring it up, even if you don't have much to say. You've got to show the regulators that you're sensitized to this, that you're aware of it as an emerging issue, and that your bank is concerned about it. You're not indifferent, you're not passive. It's very important to show that your bank is proactive on this stuff and not passive or indifferent about it.
And perhaps take the approach, say we're not talking about climate change,
Right.
we're talking about climate risk.
Right.
And so is that 5 minutes? Okay. What about the banks that are under 100 billion? I would say that there's a very, very good chance that a very high percentage of the banks that are here today, and there might even be some mortgage companies that are here, you're under $100 billion in assets. You're a community bank in Massachusetts or Connecticut, you're a shoreline bank, and your market are the shoreline towns. And what am I supposed to do? Am I not supposed to rent a loan to these people? And if I was a bank president, and when you and I talked about that, Len, and when we first met about this, that's the first question I asked. I'm a community bank on a shoreline. What do you want me to do?
Well, I'll quickly comment. There's an old saying, misery loves company. Well, believe it or not, I think the regulations like New York State, they're going to apply to all banks of all sizes.
Yes.
And they're going to apply to non-banks, to credit unions.
Mortgage companies?
Do I hear any reaction to that? And mortgage companies, et cetera. So this is any entity that's a financial services entity, I think is going to be subject to this kind of scrutiny. So, and I met with Commissioner Perez only Wednesday, basically. We were talking about CRA and we talked about climate risk, and he urged me, he said, get over to the state insurance department. He said, they are definitely looking at this stuff, and it's of great interest to the insurance industry as well. So I'm going to be trying to arrange a meeting with the Commissioner of Insurance for the state of Connecticut next week, too.
Yeah, and just one more thought, that the bank that I was referring to in Maine, one of the things where the regulators actually came from was in disaster recovery and key data centers. So that's where the regulators kind of approached it from. They wanted to say, where are your key data centers? Where do you house certain information? And have you addressed that as part of your disaster recovery plans overall? Not necessarily climate risk, but they were trying to dovetail or tie climate risk into disaster recovery plans. So there is angles that they can come in and obviously poke and prod. And I think that you're probably going to see a lot more questions coming your way.
Joe, closing comment?
Only thing I would add to any of that, I think it's all spot on. The reason that all of this makes it an even bigger headache and why banks need to be more proactive. You mentioned all of the other, non-banks, credit unions, others that are covered. They're not examined the way that banks are, and so all of that might apply, but it's really going to be you that is going to get the focus.
Okay.
Mark, I see some Pittsburgh Steelers fans coming in here. I think we got to get ready for Rocky Blair might come charging up on stage here any second.
Well, I want to thank our panel for this conversation, and I want to thank the audience for participating and listening in on today. So enjoy the rest of the conference, and Vince Valbo, thank you for giving us this opportunity to present this topic. Thank you. Good job, fellas. Good job.